I'm actually going to jump into my bonus idea of the day that I think is the most controversial, at least maybe to listeners of this program, but it fits in right now. And the reason it's controversial is because it challenges something that I'll bet many of you think is a good idea, or at least might feel to some extent is a good idea, which is the right to health care, the idea that health care is a right. And so my second idea, or my bonus idea rather, is that the corona crackdown, this tyrannical behavior, this indefinite universal isolation, illustrates the tyrannical nature of the, quote, right to health care. So my view of health, so health care is an aspect of health. My view of health is a responsibility. So it's a responsibility. Individuals, and so we have a right to the pursuit of health care, including to produce different forms of health care, whether medical care, medicines, medical services, so to produce them and of course to trade with others who produce them. But fundamentally, health is a responsibility, and we should be free to pursue it and produce it. But it's our right. We have a right to be free to pursue and produce it. We don't have a right to it. Now, the prevalent view is that we have a right to healthcare. And I want to emphasize that if we have a right to healthcare, a right is something that the government enforces coercively, ultimately at the point of a gun or some other decisive form of force. And so if something is a right, that means the government gets to define what it is and control how it is pursued. So the government, if we have a right to healthcare, the government gets to decide what is and is not healthcare, and it also gets to control us in the pursuit of that because it's made it its job to give us what it considers healthcare. So then it gets to do what it wants to us to give us healthcare. So it really means the right to healthcare means the government has the right to control us in any way it wishes to provide what it considers healthcare. And I discussed this at some length, actually. I'd recommend there's a show I did with Yaron Brook, the former CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute, now the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, my former boss in a past life. And if you look up, well, I guess we can include this in the links, but it's if you just YouTube Alex Epstein, Yaron Brook, Yaron space Brook, and Corona, this will definitely come up first unless YouTube has suppressed it. So yeah, check that out. So we discuss more about this issue. But so here I want to emphasize a particular aspect of what it means to have, what we're seeing with what it means to have the right to healthcare, which is that the government, it not only gets to control, how doctors behave and how they bill and what things should be covered under insurance and on all sorts, and who gets to be a nurse and who doesn't, all these different things. It also gets to control us even more when it screws up. So what we see now is, I believe, increasing tyrannical control, largely to make up for the government's own incompetence. So I told you some of you guys weren't going to like this, but look at the two main reasons government is now demanding indefinite universal isolation. They'll often call it extreme social distancing, but there are two main reasons. There may be more, but here are two of them. So one is that our government-controlled healthcare system has failed to develop proper COVID-19 tests. I don't think that can really be disputed, that there were major failures involved here, and the government is in charge of testing. So one thing is the system has failed it has failed to develop proper tests. And then the idea is, well, we need to crack down because we have no idea who has this, and we have to be universal because you can't be selective because no one knows. I think there are problems with that argument because it's not anywhere near as contagious as measles, but nevertheless, that is a real consideration that we don't have tests, and so that makes policy a lot harder. And then the second one is that our government-controlled healthcare system allegedly will fail. So it has failed on the tests and allegedly will fail to scale healthcare to the levels needed that we would need if we were just free to practice voluntary and selective isolation. And you can see this in all the different graphs about flattening the curve. I'm sure people have heard of this, but if you just look up flattening the curve, you'll see there's the idea that if you leave people free, or if people don't distance or isolate themselves enough, then the need for healthcare will be very concentrated in time, and it will go above the system's resources, and then it'll be terrible, including like some of the stuff we've seen in Italy with like doctors being overworked and dying and this really terrible stuff. But part of that is saying, well, there's a real question of, well, why is that line as low as it is? Why can't it go up rapidly? And we've seen at least many government-related failures where the ability to scale treatment is related. There's all kinds of issues of us not being prepared. And we do have a government-controlled healthcare system. We do not have at all a free market healthcare system. We have pockets of freedom, but it's overwhelmingly a government-controlled healthcare system. So essentially, people are saying, yeah, we've failed. The government-controlled healthcare system has failed to develop proper tests, and it will fail to scale. Therefore, we get to force indefinite universal isolation on you. Now, they're not putting it that way, but this is what it amounts to. They're saying, yeah, we can't control this problem that we've taken responsibility for, and we've prohibited you in all sorts of ways from taking responsibility. So now we get to, in effect, do whatever we want. And it's really like, we get to keep you in your house. We get to lock you down. There's no right to assemble. I mean, what happened to the Constitution? It's just there's almost not a thought. So I just think it's really worth reflecting on this idea that it's moral and desirable to have rights to specific products and services. That always means the government gets to define what they are, and it gets to control you in its pursuit. And so it's just a fundamental point about liberty and human flourishing, and why it's so important for us to be free to pursue things by our own judgment, where we can define what we want and we can control how to pursue it. And then if we want to help others, then we can work to do that depending on what they want to pursue. But the idea that it's a right that's enforced by the government, that necessarily leads the government to define these things in very perverse ways, and it leads them to control us in very perverse ways. You guys have anything you want to add on that one?
Just one thing, which is, I think it's important to see that what's happening is that a lot of the decisions are being made on the basis of fear and uncertainty. And what, we advocate in energy, and what you talk about also in the broader conception of human flourishing, is our need for a framework for decision making, a framework that helps us make decisions about what will best promote human flourishing. And so without that framework, I think you could easily imagine seeing us swing back and forth between, isolation, indefinite universal isolation, and then, all right, people get frustrated, and so we'll just go back to life. But that doesn't quite work out because we get overwhelmed, like Italy. You could see all sorts of scenarios happening, and nobody would know what would happen the next week, and it could be very paralyzing. And what a framework would allow you to do is you would still have fear and uncertainty, but you would have a decision-making process that would give you as much certainty as possible in that kind of context, and let you make the best decisions possible to navigate through it. And that's, I think that's sort of what we should be aiming for first and foremost, is a framework so that we're not making these arbitrary, unpredictable decisions.
And note that there's almost no interest certainly from government in this, and no recognition of the havoc that it's wreaking, and in terms of not having a framework and not having a policy. And what happens is it defaults toward something that is often indefensible. So right now, indefinite universal isolation, that's defaulting toward the only goal is slowing transmission of the virus. And I'd highly recommend listening to particularly the first 15 or 20 minutes of my interview with Yaron Brook, where we really challenge that goal in some depth. But that is not a pro-human flourishing goal, to say we're going to reduce the transmission of a virus at all costs. And the thing I keep emphasizing on that show, and I'll emphasize a little bit here, is that the fundamental need of life, of survival, let alone everything else, is production. And so you cannot just impede in haphazardly people's ability to produce, and many people's ability to produce as well as to enjoy life depends on close social interaction. And just, it's so many people's productive ability is being compromised. And then there's this whole dimension that, well, okay, now we're just going to give them welfare and different handouts and stuff. And we can get into the justice angle of that. But in terms of production, that's not making people more productive. That's you're still diminishing productive ability across the board, and it very much resembles what we talk about in energy, where the lower cost energy is, the lower cost, which ultimately means the less human time it takes to produce any value. And you can think of it as the more freedom of social interaction you have, the more different kinds of value you can create, and the more value of any kind you can create. So there are all sorts of values that come from or that are connected to social interaction. And so just to universally promote isolation indefinitely, that is just so catastrophic to our ability to produce and flourish. And the idea is, oh, well, we'll send you some bills and then that'll make it right. Like that's going to be like if you get a government, whatever they want to call it, like dividend, that's going to make up for your restaurant can no longer work or your events business can no longer work. That is not, that is, a huge blow. And I just wish that the people commenting on the threats involved with the virus, I really wish that they acknowledged the threats involved in isolating people. And if they did that, I would trust their recommendations much more. And it's quite analogous actually to certain climate scientists who just don't acknowledge any benefit to the energy use that comes with CO2 emissions. And then if they don't do that, you have every reason to think they're exaggerating any negatives of the CO2 emissions. Because if you ignore the benefits of something, even the obvious benefits of something, it's very likely that you are exaggerating the negative side effects.